Hello, welcome back to the Auto Contouring Review. In today's video we'll be looking at a paper that performed an evaluation of deep learning contouring for head and neck organs at risk. This paper is by Sanne van Dijk, and later on in the video we'll be discussing the paper with her to get her thoughts on what the paper shows. In this study they performed a fairly comprehensive evaluation of two auto-contouring systems, comparing a deep learning contouring system to an atlas-based contouring system using 30 atlases. The evaluation follows the recommendation of Vincenzo Valentini in performing quantitative analysis, Hausdorff distance, dice, etc., and considering the dosimetric impact of edits. Then for a subset of the organs at risk, they also performed a subjective evaluation using multiple observers to see how acceptable the contours are, and considered a time-saving study. How long does it take to edit the auto contours to become clinically acceptable? So what did they find? For the quantitative measures, typically the deep learning contouring outperforms the multi-atlas based contouring when compared to the clinical ground truth. And for the dosimetric evaluation, the edits required to the deep learning contouring seem to be less dosimetrically significant than those required when you're editing atlas-based contouring. And in the subjective evaluation, the clinicians tended to prefer the deep learning contouring over the atlas-based contouring, thinking it required less editing than the atlas-based contouring. Interestingly, as we found in other papers, the clinicians wanted to edit the manual contours, however, with up to 30% of the ground truth clinical contours being flagged for editing by those observers. This paper this paper shows a nice summary table showing the green boxes where deep learning contouring was found to be better, orange boxes where the atlas-based contouring was found to be better, and the blue boxes where there was no significant difference between the two. Finally, considering the time saving, the paper is quite interesting, taking two observers to look at the editing time required to edit the contours. The experienced observer, there was no statistical difference between editing atlas contouring versus editing deep learning contouring. But for a less experienced dosimetrist, there was a statistical difference, with the deep learning contouring being faster to edit. And this will be discussed with Sanne in the interview. So let's look now at that interview to see what she has to say about the paper.
Hi Sanne, thank you for joining me today to talk about your paper on evaluating deep learning contouring.
Thank you for inviting me.
No worries. Let's kick off maybe with perhaps you can tell people who you are, what you're working on. I know you did this paper during your PhD. Things have changed. Let's hear a little bit about yourself.
Well, so I've moved to the US. I have now a dual affiliation at MD Anderson and UMCG Groningen, and I've been very much enjoyed working with you on the deep learning development for the auto segmentation, and we really need that software for the research we're doing currently as well, because we do big data on dose extraction for organs at risk for NTCP modeling. But not only that, we're also extracting image features at large scales from the CTs, but also MRIs, quantitative MRIs, to basically improve the prediction of toxicities after radiotherapy. And it's been very helpful to have a consistent way of contouring organs at risk because it's very time intensive, as you can see in the paper. But yeah, it's been helpful, and we're continuing also to see if we can we can apply it and standardize it together with the University of Michigan.
So you're interested in really coming at auto contouring. It's not been so much about the clinical use and the dosimetrists doing the contouring, but actually how you can then apply it to big data and do get additional information out of data sets that have maybe already been contoured, already been treated.
Hey, Mark, don't get me wrong. Obviously, I'm also for improvement in the clinic, but indeed, as a scientist doing big data and machine learning, that is obviously my interest. Although I must say, actually, the quality aspects of the contours sometimes are actually need to be higher to do big data and machine learning than actually in the clinic when you only focus on avoiding certain areas where it might not matter as much, especially when you're in photon, whether or not it's a little bit to the side. But when you're looking at characteristic in a parotid gland and you're taking a big like non-parotid structure, then all of a sudden you're saying, oh, there's a big heterogeneity difference, which is not representative of what it actually means.
Yeah, so the bar is higher in a way in the research field than in the clinical one.
Yeah, somewhat. Yeah, somewhat. Depends on what you do, I guess.
So in this paper, I mean, this paper was more clinically focused, looking at essentially commissioning of auto contouring, following Vicente's Professor Valentino's paper, looking at different ways to establish evidence around auto contouring. In this paper, you compared to Atlas contouring, and you found that actually the time saved against Atlas contouring wasn't as much as we'd hoped with deep learning. Now, a lot of papers compare to manual contouring, but you chose to do Atlas contouring as the sort of ground truth baseline, I guess, standard.
Yeah, I mean,
and why was that?
I mean, it's definitely a much higher bar because Atlas contouring has already been around for a while, and so that's also our issue, right? Because for a lot of these contours, we're actually already using that in clinic. So for us to say, well, I want to compare with manual contours, and I have to tell the dosimetrist that they have to go into a different path that they clinically do, which is use the Atlas-based contouring as an initial point to start with the contouring, and tell them, no, go back 5 years in the past and do it again manually. I mean, that's just not something. And I also think it's a benefit. Maybe in the time-saving component, we can talk about that a bit more, why it might not have such a big impact. But for all the other markers in terms of Dice and Hausdorff and all the subjective markers that we looked at, it's really to see whether or not this is your reference and can we improve it. I don't think it's fair to say, oh, we're pretending like we're starting from scratch, which was not the case.
Yeah, so I mean, Atlas contouring is UMCG's clinical reference essentially, and if you're going to save time, you have to save time about where you are now, not as you say.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's the initial point, right? Because they're all adapted.
Yeah. And because of that, because Atlas contouring had been used, actually the training set in this study had been built partially using Atlas contouring already, although obviously they've been edited for clinical use. Do you think that influenced the results?
I think it did, because it's sort of a slightly more favorable towards the Atlas-based contouring, because I mean, if the contourer thought, oh, this is already quite good. But on the other hand, for the smaller structures, they didn't use the Atlas-based contouring because especially with smaller structures, the Atlas-based contouring really doesn't do as well. And because of that, I think because we included 22 orbits at risk, for which I think so roughly around 10 are clinically being used with the Atlas, but all the other ones are not. So it's a bit. So, but I do think, but again, I also don't think it's bad, because if you want to show that deep learning is better, then then at least if it shows it's better now, it's really because you've biased towards the atlas, right? So it's like it's been a you're whatever
it's won an unfair fight.
yeah, exactly, which is even better, I believe.
Yeah.
Like that's my opinion.
And in the paper, I mean, you've done a broad assessment that included the subjective test, and people tended to rate, or the observers rated deep learning as more acceptable than atlas. But that would suggest perhaps we should have seen a greater time saving. And in the discussion, you then attributed this to maybe different observers doing the test between the observational one being done by the radiation oncologists and the contouring one being done by the technicians. Can you expand on that?
So that's true. We had a lot more observers for the subjective analysis than for because the time saving obviously takes a lot of time. This is also why this is limited. As you can see, for the beginner, there is actually a lot more. There was actually significant time benefit, but for the expert, not so much. And I think this had to do with the fact that the expert really sees all the minor mistakes and wants to edit them. So in that sense, she also expressed to me that she had to, there's always stuff you can edit, but on the other hand, she also said, well, if I look at my own contour a week from now, I'll probably re-edit it as well. And this is also my experience in the boundless of parotid glands I've contoured, that if you look at your own contours a little bit further in time, you're going to be critical of them as well.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that, and I found it interesting. Like 30% of the clinical contours in this paper are judged as needing editing, even some of them are like with major obvious errors. Yeah. And I did wonder if we'd have given the observers or those doing the editing a bunch of clinical contours, would we have found any time saving, or are we essentially editing within intra-observer variation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I applaud a study to do that one. It would be very funny. But I do think that it will still take at least 15 minutes per patient. I mean, also consider, right, there's 7 challenging organs at risk that we did. So even if you give them someone else's manual contours, then there will be some editing. And that's also what we saw, because in order to QA this entire set, which is 750 patients total within the CYTO project, you've seen like they've been all checked twice, which has been taking at least 2 years to establish a data set like that. So that already indicates that every cycle the contours both improve, but also it's very time consuming.
Yeah. And the last sort of benefit you focused on in the discussion was actually around robustness. So the larger data set used to train deep learning, that greater flexibility should mean it's more robust than atlas contouring. And so do you think, is that a motivation for clinical use beyond raw time saving?
I believe it is. I think if you can get all the variations in there, even if you're an odd case, you still get a better contour than if within the atlas, which is usually between 10 and 15 patients that are going the atlas. Sometimes a little bit more, but if there's a patient that doesn't fit within the geometry of the patient, then it won't fit very well. I mean, it obviously depends on the deformable registration algorithms that back it up, but still, if it's very different size patients, and let's say you have a larger patient, but the submandibulars are smaller, then if that's not in your atlas set, then it will not do as well. And the counter of that is that I think for deep learning you do have to be very more so than with atlas based, you have to be very careful that you're not showing it data that have different image characteristics that haven't been shown to it before, or program it in so it sort of weaponizes itself against it. And therefore it's always good, obviously, to do before implementing anything deep learning, to do a QA of whatever you had before, and then also what you have now.
Yeah, you really need to understand that data set.
Yeah, and that is the more challenging part of learning. And I think atlas-based contouring is a little less, requires that a little less. Although also if you have very different image sets, then obviously. Yep. But that's more driven by the formal registration, obviously.
So one last question: why should somebody go and read this paper?
I think to me that's a tricky question to me, because I like this paper because it has so many different scientific ways of comparing, not only to the ground truth but also to a different sort of reference entity. And I think from a methodological standpoint, I find it very interesting that we've really touched upon subjective, and in that sense, I mean, obviously I'm excited about the auto contouring, but I think why people should read the paper is also because it touches upon all these different testing mechanisms to look at the differences.
Really, because it's such a broad evaluation rather than a simple measure of dice score or anything.
I mean, it's a lot of work. So I understand all the paper. Like I can tell you, it's a lot of work. Yeah. It really gives you the comprehensive view, and not only the dice score is better, which is, I mean, as you know from being a leading figure in the Turing test is definitely not covering it all. These subjective measures also matter.
Yeah. Okay. Well, thanks for joining me today, and I hope your continued research on the big data side goes well.
Oh well. Thank you so much, Mark. Yeah.
So following that discussion with Sanne, I think the most interesting question raised by this paper is, when do we stop editing? As we saw in the subjective assessment, the clinicians wanted to edit the approved clinical contours in many of the cases. And as Sanne observed, the expert delineator in that study actually said that she would want to edit her own clinical contours. So we're unable to achieve maximum time saving if clinical staff are going to tweak contours which at one stage they deemed perfectly acceptable. And perhaps this is a challenge for auto-contouring, but I think it's also a challenge for clinical staff to learn when it's appropriate to edit, when it's necessary to edit, and when those edits make no clinical difference. Hopefully we'll be able to perform that study one day that Sanne proposed, of looking at the editing time for approved clinical contours. I think that would be maybe a useful educational tool. Thanks for listening, and I hope you'll join me again soon for another auto contouring.